Welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Dr. P.P. Ajay Kumar, Professor of English, School of Distance Education, University of Kerala. Today we will discuss the novel To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which is part of the paper 20th Century English Literature. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 in a very prestigious literary family because her father was Leslie Stephen, who was the editor of a Dictionary of National Biography, and her mother was Julia Stephen, who was a model for the pre-Raphaelite painters. So her family was full of interesting people who are literary figures of that time, and so from early childhood days she has got initiation to writing. Though she was born in a very prestigious family, she had many unhappy experiences in her life because her mother died at a very early age, and after the death of her mother she has to experience several nervous breakdowns, and it led to several attempts to suicide, and this was a problem that continuously haunted Virginia Woolf all through her life. And it is also a very pitiable thing that in 1941 she committed suicide because of the same fear of becoming mad. Virginia Woolf was married to Mr. Leonard Woolf, who founded the Hogarth Press, and Leonard Woolf was a very loving husband to her, but at the same time she could not go along with him in a very happy fashion, and there were several problems in their married life. But towards the end she wrote in a letter before her suicide that she doesn't want to trouble him more because she expects that she will go mad, and she was ready to commit suicide because she doesn't want to trouble her husband. The most important novels written by Virginia Woolf are Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, A Room of One's Own. And To the Lighthouse actually became one of the important novels in her career because it tries to present the experience of in the life of a woman, and it actually brings forth the kind of cultural transformation that was happening in England at that time, from the Victorian to the modern period, because the novel also tries to look into her own personal life. So in that sense it can be considered as an autobiographical novel as well. As we have seen earlier, Virginia Woolf had the privilege of being part of a lot of intellectuals of that time, mainly because of the fact that she was born in such a family. She was very close to intellectuals like Lytton Strachey, Clive Bell, Rupert Brooke, Saxon Sidney Turner, Duncan Grant, Leonard Woolf, etc. And they had regular discussions on topics like feminism, pacifism, and sexuality. This helped her come to terms with the contemporary intellectual developments of that time, and she was able to respond to issues related to women, sexuality, etc., mainly because of the influence of this Bloomsbury group. This intellectuals, economists, and artists and writers of this group actually contributed much for the development of feminism and modern ideas on sexuality and pacifism. Virginia Woolf is considered to be a modernist mainly because of the fact that she introduced the new kind of complex narrative style that became very popular in the modernist period. We are remembered of writers like Marcel Proust, who tried to use memory as a mechanism to break the control of time. Marcel Proust used techniques like introducing certain smells or certain objects to go to the past. He broke the linear development of time and tried to argue that time moves in a circular fashion. So Virginia Woolf, in her novel To the Lighthouse, tried to compress time and use memory as a kind of mechanism to overcome the control of time. There was also a kind of shift in the sensibility during that period, mainly because of the social and political transformations that were happening at that time, especially after the First World War. The kind of realistic narrative that was very popular in the 19th century was slowly coming to an end, and the modern narrative, which focuses on certain particular moments in the life of a person and going deep into the psyche of that person, analyzing the complex, intricate problems that torment the mind of a man, that began to be the kind of technique used by the modernist writers. And Virginia Woolf is one of the writers who started using it in the early period of modernism. There is also the change in the narrator. The omniscient narrator was absent, and the use of multiple narrators and the kind of unraveling the mind of the characters began to appear in novels. To the Lighthouse was also a kind of example for this kind of experimentation in the narrative structure of the novel. The stream of consciousness is another important term that is often associated with the novel To the Lighthouse. As everybody knows, stream of consciousness technique became popular with the emergence of writers like James Joyce, and very long passages of introspection is one of the characteristics of the stream of consciousness novel. The experiences and thoughts that pass through the mind of the character and the various manifestations of these thoughts in the form of visuals, in the form of memory, in the form of various other experiences, all mingle in the stream of consciousness narrative. So the mental process is brought to light in all its complexity in this narrative. And To the Lighthouse also tries to present or use the stream of consciousness technique, and we find that it unravels the mind of the Mrs. Ramsay, the female protagonist of this novel, with all its complexities through this technique. But it is to be noted that James Joyce and Virginia Woolf are different in their technique, that means the narrative technique. Virginia Woolf uses the stream of consciousness technique with a lot of control. That is, she never allows the characters and their thoughts to flow without any control. There is a kind of compactness in her narrative. At the same time, there are very rare insights and the characters present their ordinary experiences of life, which are full of very subtle insights about life. So now we will pass on to the novel as such. The novel To the Lighthouse has a plot which is not at all traditional. In the traditional Victorian or realistic novels, what we find is a story being narrated from the beginning to the end. But this particular novel consists of a series of experiences, memoirs, emotions and feelings explained through various images and symbols. The story does not have a kind of compactness which is commonly found in the realistic novel. The incidents in this novel are not at all dramatic, and the kind of experiences that are narrated are very ordinary, or they appear to be very ordinary. But even then, what matters is the kind of impression that all these experiences have in the mind of the characters. It is the characters and their reactions, their thoughts and workings in their consciousness that is given greater importance in this novel. I think now we could look at some of the important characters in this novel. The central character in this novel is Mrs. Ramsay, wife of Mr. Ramsay. Mrs. Ramsay is an extremely beautiful lady, and she is a wonderful hostess. She is a very traditional woman. She loves to look after her children. She has 8 children, and she also is interested in taking care of other people, the guests in the house. And it is also specifically suggested that she always look after the male guests rather than the female guests. So Mrs. Ramsay is a typical traditional Victorian woman who believes in the traditional role of a woman, the traditional gender role of a woman. Whereas Mr. Ramsay is a philosopher, and even though a philosopher, he always faces psychological problems of instability and lack of confidence. He loves his family very much, but at the same time he is very rude to his children as well as to his wife. He always desires for the support, psychological support of his wife, and he is never happy with what he is. Even though a philosopher, he feels that nothing in this world is permanent, or nothing in this world will remain forever, and he is always troubled by the thought that his ideas and his thoughts and his philosophy will vanish once he disappears from this world. And the next important character in this novel is Lily Briscoe. She is a painter and an unmarried woman. Being a woman painter, she faces lots of problems because she is often told that a woman as painter will never succeed in life. So she is always irritated by comments by the male guests saying that she will not be successful as a painter because there is no history of a woman as a successful painter. On the other hand, Lily is a very strong woman, and she is never ready to get married, even though she was persuaded by Mrs. Ramsay on several occasions. And at the last part of the novel, we find that she succeeds as a painter and she remains single throughout her life. James Ramsay is the youngest son, and Prue Ramsay, Rose Ramsay, Nancy Ramsay, Cam Ramsay, all these are the important members of the family. And there were 7 guests who come to join the Ramsay family, and they together go for a vacation. Paul Rayleigh, Minta Royal, Charles Transley, William Banks, Augustus Carmichael. These are the important guests who visit the family, and they spend some time together. And it is during this period that we come across the kind of interaction that happened within the family, between the family members as well as between the guests and the family members. So the whole action in the novel is very, very little, and it is divided into 3 different sections: the window, time passes, the lighthouse. If the first section, the window, covers 7 hours in the life of these characters, we find that major part of the novel is covered by this particular section, whereas time passes covers 10 years in the life of these characters, but it has only few pages. So we find that the action represented in the narrative is more focused in the psyche of the characters rather than outside, and that is how she tries to look into the mind of the characters. The window actually is the major section of the book, and it takes about half of the book, and it speaks about the family and the visitors and their kind of enjoyment that they had together. The Ramsay and their 8 children entertaining a lot of friends and colleagues, and they had a very happy time together. And this part actually presents the important characters in the novel: Mrs. Ramsay, Mr. Ramsay, Lily, etc., and introduces the problem that is presented in the novel. It is in this section that we come across the patience, love and care that Mrs. Ramsay gives to her children as well as to the guests. She is always ready to support them and care them, and at the same time she looks after all the important things that the guests demand. And Lily always complained that Mrs. Ramsay has a special love for the male guests, and Mrs. Ramsay is not at all offended by any of the comments made by the guests. More than that, we find that she was always ready to please them and love them and support them. Another aspect of Ramsay's character is that she wanted to make alliances between men and women. Just as in the Victorian style of life, we find Mrs. Ramsay considering it as her duty to bring together good men and women. So she tries to find alliances. And in the next section, that is the time passes, we find that about 10 years of life is presented in 20 pages, and a lot of changes happen during this period. The children grow up, war broke out, and Mrs. Ramsay dies at an early age. Andrew is killed in the battle, and Prue dies after a year of her marriage during her childbirth. So all these events happen during this gap of 10 years, but that is presented in 20 pages in the novel. And in this section, what we find is that the housekeeper, McNabb, is alone in that house. She keeps the house very neat and clean, expecting that visitors will come. But for long 10 years, nobody came. It was after 10 years that visitors came to the house, and it was Lily Briscoe who returned first. The Lighthouse is the third and the last section in the novel, and Mr. Ramsay and his children, Cam and James, visits the lighthouse. Lily is already there, and Lily tries to complete the painting that she started of Mrs. Ramsay. In the beginning section of the novel, we find Lily starting the painting of Mrs. Ramsay. Even though she was criticized by many, she continued her painting, but she was not able to finish it at that time. But now she finishes that painting and proves her worth as a painter. And then we also find Mr. Ramsay and his children visiting the lighthouse. And it was expected that they will visit the lighthouse in the first part of the novel, but because of the bad weather, Mr. Ramsay was reluctant to go, and he did not allow his children also to go to the lighthouse. But in the last part, we find Mr. Ramsay and his children visiting the lighthouse. So the novel speaks about a very small and ordinary part in the life of a few people. There is nothing dramatic that is happening there, and the experiences appear to be very ordinary. But the novel tries to present a lot of philosophical questions related to time, related to creativity, art, etc. through this novel. So let us look at the important themes in the novel. So time is certainly one of them. It is true that time is understood differently by the modern philosophers, because it was considered to be something that develops in a linear fashion in the past. But we find that with the emergence of Bergson, a famous philosopher, we find that time is considered to be something that develops in a circular fashion. And the novelists began to use the new concept of time, and the experiences and emotions of characters are portrayed using the present awareness about time. Instead of presenting the experiences from the beginning to the end in a linear fashion, they started selecting some of the timeless moments in the life of these characters and present it in a very deeper fashion in the novel. So To the Lighthouse is one such novel where life is seen in its subtle moments rather than in its entirety. And we find in the novel some of the experiences explained in detail. For example, Mrs. Ramsay's indulgence with her children and her pleasing behavior and the way she pleases her guests, all these are indicative of the kind of traditional love and affection that is given by women in the English society. Whereas In the case of Lily, another important character, what we find is she takes a different approach towards life, and she is one important character who looks at life from a very modern point of view. And she is a woman who tries to live on her own and wanted to assert her identity and her ability to paint and her decision to lead a single life are all indicators of her modern outlook. So time measured as it is experienced by certain people, that is certainly used in this novel, and at the same time we find that it adds to the complexity of the novel by helping to look at certain moments in the life of people from a very subtle point of view. Another important theme in this novel is the transience of art as well as life. Mr. Ramsay, the philosopher, is very much worried about this aspect of life. According to him, even very great writers like Shakespeare will lose his significance after some time. That means nobody is going to be remembered for a very long period of time. And she is very much affected by this fact. And Ramsay is always worried about the fact that his philosophy will not remain after his death. And he seeks the support of others, especially his wife, to sustain his confidence in himself. The third important topic that has to be discussed in relation to this novel is the permanence of art. Though Mr. Ramsay tries to assert the kind of transience of life and art, Lily, through her painting, tries to prove that art is permanent when compared to life. Even after the death of these artists, the paintings remain. And Lily completes her painting of Mrs. Ramsay, and she tries to assert the fact that the painting is permanent or art is permanent, and it has the ability to cross over time. So another important topic that has to be discussed in relation to the novel is the question of gender roles. The central figure in this novel, Mrs. Ramsay, tries to present a picture of a traditional woman, and she can be termed as a representative of the Victorian type of woman who follows the traditional gender roles as it is, whereas Lily is much against this attitude of Mrs. Ramsay, and she opposes her stance as a traditional woman. So the two characters, Mrs. Ramsay and Lily Briscoe, are representatives of two opposing ideologies. One is the Victorian ideology represented by Mrs. Ramsay, and the other is the modern ideology represented by Lily Briscoe. The novel also presents very important symbols which are significant in understanding the novel. The sea is a very important symbol that you find in the novel. The sea has been used as a symbol in many novels where it is considered to be a kind of representative of eternity or unknown things, whereas in this novel we find that it is a symbol of a kind of uncertainty or even death. The sea is a presence in the novel from the beginning to the end, and it can also be seen as a fullness of life. The sound of the sea is mentioned again and again in the novel, and it becomes very much part of the narrative. The house and the land, certainly when compared with the sea, refers to a kind of stability in life. It is a kind of shelter or stability in life, whereas the window is a kind of connecting point between the house and the sea, or house and the outer world. So it is through the window that they look at the outer world. So it is a connecting point, or at the same time it can also be a dividing point between the self and the society. A very important symbol in this novel is the lighthouse. The lighthouse forms part of the title as well. The lighthouse is a very positive symbol which refers to a kind of hope, a kind of enthusiasm, and something to be cherished. So just as in the case of other novels, we find that light is a very positive symbol. So lighthouse represents that light, the light of hope. To the Lighthouse is considered to be an autobiographical novel, even though all the incidents in this novel cannot be termed as autobiographical. There are very close similarities between the characters in the novel and the incidents and family members of Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Ramsay is certainly a picture of her own mother, and Mr. Ramsay refers to her father. There are several characteristics that are common in these characters, and her visits to her parents' family, that is at Eves, Cornwall, where her father had a house where they used to visit for short durations, that is again showed in the novel when these family members along with guests visit the place near the lighthouse. And we find that this autobiographical significance of the novel is added by the fact that Virginia Woolf most often tries to present the experiences in her own personal life in the narrative, and To the Lighthouse was very close to her heart. So in this part we have gone through the novel To the Lighthouse and the important topics that has to be discussed in relation to the novel, and we have discussed certain aspects like stream of consciousness technique, the Bloomsbury group in relation to Virginia Woolf's novel. So a closer understanding of the novel will be possible if you go through the novel keeping all these ideas in mind. So try to refer the section for further reading for more reference material related to this novel. Thank you.